Hey guys, how you doing? Just got off from a friend's place, so I'm gonna have a walk home. This is gonna be kind of a dark video, but you can rest assured in the smooth satisfaction of my wonderful radio voice. This is like the number one thing I get told all the time. I have a great voice for radio, and I love to say, and a face too. A face to match. Yeah. You can hear it, right? You're just like, welcome to John Radio. All John, all the time. Jon Radio. Anyway. My previous video was talking about depression, and I want to go more into depth on that. So if you're here for the political conversation, thank you for being here. But today's video is about depression and my experience with it and my theory about it. I think I've talked about this in a video on days past, but that's fine. It's fine to talk about these things again and again to sharpen it. So I'm going to start with what I think depression is, why I think it exists in our consciousness and in our society, what I think it's happening. People who have studied it, and I read a lot of literature on this subject as somebody who is sort of afflicted with this. You know, one day you'll just wake up and you'll just feel depressed. You'll feel depressed. And you don't know why, and you don't understand it. And that's if you have a fairly healthy relationship with depression. If you have a fairly healthy relationship with your body and with acknowledging things. Because the worst thing that can happen to you when you're dealing with depression is that you will be suffering its symptoms, or you will be existing within a depressive state, and you won't acknowledge it, or you won't recognize it. And then depression becomes your new normal. You just become this depressed individual operating in the world. And people will simply say things like, oh, that's just John. Yeah, he's a bit of a downer. He's an Eeyore, you know. And if you have good friends, they'll still love you. And they'll still invite you places. And they'll still try to have fun with you and just accept that, yeah, you're just kind of a down sort of a person. So every morning I wake up and I ask myself, am I depressed? That's what I do. I do that every morning. Because if I don't do that, then I can go through an entire day. I can go through an entire day in this depressive fugue state. And the day will pass and I'll be grumpy, or maybe I'm not treating the people around me as best as I could or as that I want to. And it's because I'm not acknowledging in myself that there is this manifested depressed state that exists, that I can, if not break free of, certainly acknowledge, work with, mitigate, and attempt to ascend from. And anytime I read any studies on this or anything like this, there's different ideas or theories or thoughts about what depression is. That some see it as a physical ailment, a chemical imbalance. Some see it as a psychological situation, that there is something in your immediate life, like you've gone through a breakup or you've gone through a recent death in the family. These are triggers for depression. And some see it as a larger spiritual experience, that you are grappling with large cosmic ideas and concepts, and living in that kind of cosmic space can be very depressing and depressive. This is where nihilism comes in. And I tend to believe that it is actually all three, and that it is a combination of these three things. That if you are, let's say, eating wrong, not getting enough sleep, this can put you in a depressive state, can imbalance you chemically. And of course, if someone in your life has died recently, or if you are grappling with existential, large-scale cosmic ideas. And I think it is a combination of all of these things that creates sort of a depressive state, and that they all operate in tandem with one another, right? That if you have recently gone through a breakup or have been fired from your job or something like this, well, chances are good that you're not going to be eating as well, right? And you're not going to be sleeping as well. Chances are good that you're going to be asking yourself larger questions of a cosmic nature, right? So they're all intertwined with one another. And I've come to believe that, like, the analogy that I create for depression is the spiral slide. I like to talk about the spiral slide because I think it's a good analogy. It's a good thing to put in your mind's eye to ask yourself, am I on the spiral slide? Can I, if I am on the spiral slide, where am I on the spiral slide? And can I ascend out of the slide? You don't want to descend down the spiral slide, because at the bottom of the spiral slide is suicide. That statement is something that I find it's so difficult for me to state. I actually feel it catch in my throat. I feel it be something that is difficult to voice, but it's something I think is fundamentally true, that the bottom of the slide is suicide. And I think that I have a different opinion of suicide as many people, I think. Like, I don't necessarily see suicide as a sin, let's say, or a sign of weakness, let's say. Anyway, that's not what I want this video to be about. What I want it to be about is the subject of depression, and to acknowledge that if you are standing on top of the slide, or, you know, you're not on the slide, right? Then you are living your life normally, right? Living your life as a person should live their life, which is day to day, moment by moment, acknowledging the people who are around you, living with them in the moment. This is what was happening during the free love movement, when people were saying, you know, live in the now. Live, the New Age people would also say this, right? Live in the now, live in the moment, live in this kind of thing. That's where happiness truly lives. Because it's completely accurate, completely true. That if you live your life in the past or in the future, you live your life in misery. Even if it's a good thing to do. Even if you are playing detective, attempting to suss something out in your past, or playing soothsayer, attempting to perceive something in the future that could happen. But if you live there all the time and you don't spend any time with the people who are around you, and when you're with those people, you're not living with them in the moment, in the now, you live your life in misery. You find yourself missing those people because you never really truly spent that time with them, right? You never really lived with them. You lived in an imaginary land that exists in your mind. But I'm jumping the gun. The slide. An analogy I think is good to think about. If you are on the slide, the top of the slide is the physical signs, right? You feel heavier. You feel, for me, I feel as though there are shackles on my wrists and around my ankles, that there's a weight that's pressed on my chest. That's why physical exercise is actually a good thing to do to combat the depressive state. And I'm not standing in judgment of those who can't get to that point. Certainly not, because it's quite difficult to get up and to combat and to fight and to struggle against the forces that you're feeling. But the first sign that you are on the slide of depression is that general sense of weight, that weightiness, where you know that you have experienced the world feeling lighter. You know you have experienced the world with with more elation, lightness, right? And now you feel an overwhelming sort of sense of heaviness. And if you have that overwhelming sense of heaviness, then chances are very good that you're at stage 1 on the slide. And that heaviness will persist throughout all stages as you continue your journey down the slide. But it gets harder to acknowledge. The farther down you go, the harder it is to actually acknowledge that I am feeling this weight. And it's a hard thing to simply acknowledge the experience, to simply say, I am experiencing this, because there's a great deal of guilt, a great deal of shame, a great deal of a sense of failure that accompanies this. To simply say, to utter out loud that I am currently feeling inadequate, I am currently feeling afflicted, and to understand, and this is very important, that affliction is not coming from without. That's something I think that's very important to understand about depression. It's not something you're being afflicted with from without. It is a sensation that is coming from within. And certainly forces outside of yourself, environmental forces, have an impact. But the sensation of depression itself is coming from within. And it is your reaction to these external stimuli. It is not the stimuli itself. And that's an important distinction to understand, because you can get caught in a blame game. So instead of dealing with your own experiences and your own feelings and your own emotions and your own self, you end up externalizing it and placing blame on other people. If only they fixed this, if only they did that. And perhaps there's some truth to it, that yes, certainly the world would be better if people stopped polluting. And yes, the world would certainly be better if there were less sociopathic maniacs. And yes, all of these things are true, but you don't control any of that, do you? You can state it to your heart's desire. You can work towards those goals as much as you want, but it's up to you to deal with yourself and your own emotions and your own feelings and your own thoughts, and to come to peace with all of that so that you can move forward, so that you can simply get out of bed. And that's the second stage, incidentally, that I was just talking about there. The second stage of depression is this mental gymnastics, this mental justification, the externalization of your depressive state. That you feel bad because the rest of the world needs to change. And perhaps the rest of the world does need to change. Let me be very clear about that, because that's something, this is where me and the conservative types diverge completely. The conservative types will not say that the world does need to change. And obviously, certainly our society needs to change. Certainly. And you will hear on this channel me argue this until the day I die. That if we are to continue forward as we are as a species, it will lead to our destruction completely, and that we need to change. But that still doesn't change that I need to come to peace with myself and do the internal work myself in order to come to peace with the fact that it's likely the world will not change. Or that if it does, it will not be enough. And that humanity likely will not be redeemed. That these are statements that I feel are true, and that I need to find inside of myself a place of peace. And how do I find that? This can be discovered in the third stage. The third stage of depression is the spiritual. That as you go down the slide, right, you start with the physical. That you feel heavy, you feel things are more difficult, you feel things are, it's difficult to even get out of bed. It's difficult to even have that shower, feed yourself, put clothing on. It's difficult to even get out of your house. Those are physical attributes that you are dealing with. The second stage is the mental. specifically the externalization of something that is very much an internal fight, that you can acknowledge the things that you would like to see changed in the world, and you can acknowledge that you will work towards those things, and you can acknowledge all of that. But at the end of the day, it is about you coming to peace with yourself in that world and finding peace, even as the external forces structure themselves to destroy not only you, but themselves. You have to find a peace. You have to find the peace with that. And the way to find the peace with that is by looking at the forces of the universe, accepting that you are much smaller than those forces, accepting that the forces of the universe are likely themselves structured to support you as they are. And this is what makes this conversation so sad, is that the forces of the universe are structured to support you so long as you play by its rules, and we aren't. And to surrender to that, to surrender to those larger forces and to those larger ideas and to those larger concepts, and that even if you are a hardcore atheist, even if you are very much like there are no gods, all of this, I think this is still an important thing to do, to accept that there are large-scale cosmic forces which certainly exist, are provable, we can see them, gravity, right? Like, unless you're, I don't know what your position could possibly be to simultaneously deny the existence of gods, but also deny the forces of the universe. And so to accept that there are forces in the universe, chaotic as they may be, that you don't control, and to humble yourself before those forces, to understand that those forces do exist within a balance, and if you don't humble yourself towards them, they can destroy you. They can rip you apart. And if you don't do this, right, this is where that woe is me mentality comes from. This is where the sense of, like, conservatives will say, well, you can't believe the world owes you something. The world doesn't owe you anything. As if that's an actual solution. But there is this kernel of truth in that statement, which is that if you are moping about in a woe is me kind of a place that is indicative of depressive types, then you are well on your way to the final stage of depression, which is suicide. Because the world is not going to alter itself for you. The world is not going to change itself on your whim, because the world is much larger than you are, and it doesn't owe you anything, right? The universe created you. It can do what it wants with you. And if you don't accept that, if you live in this sort of state where you feel as though things are owed to you, you feel as though you deserve better from the plane that spawned you, and you don't come to peace with the idea that, well, even though you know that things could be better, even though you know that things could improve, even though you know that we could live in a more peaceable world where that's certainly one that's not structured to destroy itself, where a society isn't structured to destroy itself completely. Well, even though you know that, you have to come to terms with the fact that that's not going to happen, and that you have less control over it than you would like to have. And it's only through doing that, through humbling yourself, while simultaneously seizing a hold of what you know to be true and what you know to be right, to fight for something that is better, while simultaneously saying, I am not the only thing that is responsible for this, right? relinquishing that expectation and relinquishing that responsibility from yourself, I think is crucial. That you can only alter your own feelings and your own thoughts, and you can express these opinions, and you can express these feelings and express these thoughts, which I think is very important, because that means that people don't live in isolation, in intellectual isolation or spiritual isolation, right? Because around you, people believe in the things you believe, but they feel that they are crazy for believing them, or they feel that they are isolated. And it's only when people actually talk to one another about these ideas and about these thoughts and about these concepts that they come to realize that they are not isolated. That's why I think this channel is so important. It's important for people to hear that the thoughts that you are having are not absurd or insane. That there are millions of people who think the way that you think. You just haven't found them yet. And hopefully this channel, as well as other channels that definitely exist along these lines, will act as kind of a lightning rod for people of these ideas to come together and organize and actually change the world. Because that's how you actually change the world. It's never one individual person shifting things in this dramatic kind of way as we were taught when we were growing up. It's an organized structure of humanity. It's humans agreeing with one another as individuals to form a collective. And if you don't do this, right? Like if you are a person who is inflicted with this depression, if you don't do this, if you don't do the internal investigation, if you don't submit and humble yourself to the forces you cannot control, while simultaneously pushing towards improving what it is you know needs to be improved, then you can make it to the bottom of the slide. And what's so interesting about the dynamic, right? So depression will bring you to the choice of suicide. And it presents you with this statement that you are helpless, that you cannot win, that you are worthless or without value. And it presents you with this choice of saying, and so the only thing to do is to commit suicide. But committing suicide is quite a dramatic act, and not without a high level of decision and choice. And if you are seeking to commit suicide, there are so many things that you could choose to do before that point. And so it's a paradox that exists within the realm of depression and this moment of suicide, because if you are so helpless and worthless and pathetic and all of these things that your depressive self wants you to believe, and you are without power, then you shouldn't be able to commit suicide at all. That the act of committing suicide is itself a seizure of great power. You are seizing power and taking things into your own hands. And if you can commit suicide, right? Well, there's all kinds of things that you can do. You can leave, right? You can move. You can... If you are resolved to die anyway, you can go live on the street. And I'm not saying that facetiously. Truly, I'm not. Like, if your endeavor is that you will eventually die, well, then there are many things that you can do before that point. And if you are convinced that it is a toxic living environment or a toxic family environment, you can leave. And yes, it will be difficult, and yes, it will be hard, and yes, there will be obstacles, and yes, all of these things. will come down crashing down upon you. Absolutely. None of that is false. But it will actually be easier than committing suicide. And so I strongly advise to people who are struggling with depression, with anxiety, right? To make this their morning ritual, to make this something that they do. Ask yourself, do I feel heavy today? Do I feel weighted down today? Do I think the world is out to get me? Do I think that I am structured to fail? All of these are that depressive thought, that sense of nihilism creeping up your back. And once you've acknowledged it, that's the trick. Once you've acknowledged it, then it's about ascending the slide. It's about climbing up the slide. And that's very difficult. That's very difficult work to do. It's very difficult to humble yourself before the forces of the universe. It's very difficult to accept the world as it is, while accepting that you wish to change the world, and then coming to peace and accepting that it is most likely that the world will not change as you wish it to change. And then to ascend up through the physical, that maybe you should work out a little bit more. Maybe you should go for a walk. Maybe you should get into nature. Maybe you could do something for yourself instead of expecting someone else to do something for you. Because ultimately, you are struggling with yourself. And that's the hardest thing for anyone to do in this plane of reality. It isn't to struggle with other people and other people's thoughts and other people's opinions, although that is a struggle, certainly. It is to struggle with yourself. That's the most difficult thing that a person will ever do, is to struggle with themselves. Because a toxic person or a toxic environment, you can leave. You can let them pass you by, right? You can pretend as though you were just a visitor. You had a little vacation in their weird little toxic life, and that their punishment is that they have to continue living with themselves as you leave and attempt to deal with yourself, in the hope that you were not participating in that toxic environment. In the hope and that you were not a large piece, or perhaps the central piece, of that toxic environment. And that's very difficult, to analyze the self and to see one's own mistakes and one's own errors. Anyway, I could continue talking on this subject at great length. I haven't even gotten to the idea that I think depression is ultimately a good thing. That depression slows a person down. That it allows them and gives them the time, or begs them to investigate further in the cause of this malady. But time passes. I love you all. Like, share, subscribe. Heck, if you're not subscribed, you made it here. Chances are very good you're going to like this channel, especially when this is the kind of content that you're going to get. I hope you're all doing very well. I love you all. Good luck. We're going to need it.